You know that moment when you're driving a car, and something about the way it shifts gears just feels off, not broken exactly, just strange. Maybe you press the accelerator in traffic and the car hesitates for a moment. Then suddenly it moves. Or you're crawling through a parking lot and the car feels a little jerky, almost like it's unsure of what gear it wants. Now here's the confusing part. The same car that feels awkward in slow traffic can suddenly feel incredibly fast when you accelerate on an open road. The gear shifts happen almost instantly, no delay, just one gear after another snapping into place. That's usually when you discover the car has something called a dual clutch transmission, or DCT, and depending on who you ask, this transmission is either brilliant engineering or one of the most frustrating gearboxes ever made. So what's actually going on here? Why does a DCT feel amazing in some situations and awkward in others? Today on Techie Tales, we're breaking down how the dual clutch transmission actually works, why it shifts so quickly, and why some drivers think it's problematic. Once you understand what's happening inside the gearbox, a lot of those strange behaviors suddenly make sense. Before we understand a dual clutch transmission, we need to quickly talk about why cars need transmissions in the first place. Car engines are surprisingly picky about how they operate. They produce power best within a certain speed range called the RPM range. If the engine spins too slowly, it struggles to produce enough power. If it spins too fast, it can overheat or get damaged. So the transmission acts as the bridge between the engine and the wheels. It changes gear ratios so the engine can stay in its ideal operating range while the car speeds up or slows down. For many years, drivers had two main choices: a manual transmission where the driver controls when gears change, or an automatic transmission where the car handles the shifting on its own. Both systems work well, but both come with compromises. In a manual car, shifting gears requires 3 steps. First, the driver presses the clutch pedal. This disconnects the engine from the transmission. Then they move the gear lever into the next gear, and finally they release the clutch so power flows back to the wheels. It works, but there's always a brief moment where the engine is no longer sending power to the wheels. That's why manual cars sometimes feel like they pause slightly between gear changes. Automatic transmissions solve that problem differently. Instead of a clutch pedal, they use something called a torque converter. This allows the engine to remain connected to the transmission even while gears are changing. The result is very smooth gear shifts, but there's a downside. Traditional automatics can lose some efficiency because power moves through a fluid coupling. They can also feel slower when shifting gears. So engineers started asking an interesting question. What if we could combine the efficiency of a manual transmission with the convenience of an automatic? That idea eventually led to the development of the dual clutch transmission. Despite sounding complicated, the basic concept behind a dual clutch transmission is actually very clever. Instead of using one clutch, the system uses 2, but those 2 clutches are doing something very specific. Inside the transmission, the gears are divided into 2 groups. One clutch controls the odd-numbered gears, 1st gear, 3rd gear, 5th gear, sometimes even 7th gear. The other clutch controls the even-numbered gears, 2nd gear, 4th gear, 6th gear. Now imagine you're accelerating in 1st gear. While you're still driving in 1st gear, the transmission has already prepared 2nd gear in the background. 2nd gear is ready, it's just waiting. So the moment the car decides to shift, one clutch disengages while the other engages. The change happens extremely quickly, often in just a few milliseconds. Because the next gear was already prepared, the engine continues delivering power with almost no interruption. That's why DCT cars can feel incredibly quick during acceleration. This technology became especially popular in performance cars. When you're trying to accelerate as quickly as possible, even a small delay between gear shifts can slow the car down. Traditional manual shifts may take half a second. A dual clutch transmission can shift in a tiny fraction of that time. That difference might sound small, but it makes a big impact on performance. The faster the gearbox shifts, the faster the car can continue accelerating. This is why many sports cars use dual clutch gearboxes. Drivers get extremely fast gear changes, along with the ability to manually control shifts using paddle shifters. On an open road or during aggressive driving, a DCT can feel incredibly responsive. But this is where things start to get interesting. Because what works perfectly during fast driving doesn't always feel great during slow driving. A dual clutch transmission still uses actual clutches, similar to those found in a manual car. The difference is that computers control them instead of the driver. When the car starts moving from a stop, the clutch has to engage gradually. Just like when a human driver slowly releases the clutch pedal in a manual vehicle. In stop-and-go traffic, this process happens repeatedly. The clutches engage, disengage, and engage again. Sometimes the computer struggles to make this process perfectly smooth. That's why some drivers notice small jerks at low speeds, or a slight hesitation before the car begins moving. It can feel like the transmission is thinking about what it wants to do next. In most cases, nothing is actually wrong. It's simply the way a dual clutch system operates. Another issue people sometimes notice with DCT transmissions is heat. Clutches rely on friction to work, and friction always produces heat. In heavy traffic where the car constantly stops and starts, the clutches may partially engage many times in a short period. This repeated engagement can cause heat to build up inside the transmission. Some cars even display warnings telling the driver to allow the transmission to cool down. There are two main types of DCT systems: dry clutch systems and wet clutch systems. Dry clutches are simpler and cheaper to produce, but they tend to generate more heat. Wet clutches sit inside transmission fluid, which helps keep them cool. However, wet clutch systems are more complex and more expensive. Dual clutch transmissions are impressive pieces of engineering, but they are also complex. They rely on advanced electronics, sensors, and a component called the mechatronic unit. The mechatronic system acts like the brain of the transmission. It decides when gears should change and how the clutches should engage. If something goes wrong with this system, repairs can be expensive. That's one reason some drivers prefer simpler automatic transmissions. Not because DCT is bad technology, but because it's more complicated. Every type of transmission has its strengths. Traditional automatic transmissions are usually the smoothest in everyday driving. CVT transmissions are very efficient and keep the engine operating at its most efficient speed. But some drivers dislike the way CVTs feel during acceleration. Dual clutch transmissions focus on speed and performance. They shift extremely quickly and can make a car feel more responsive, but they sometimes sacrifice smoothness at very low speeds, so the best transmission really depends on how the car is used. The dual clutch transmission is one of the most interesting innovations in modern automotive engineering. It combines the efficiency of a manual gearbox with the speed and convenience of computer-controlled shifting. That's why it's so popular in performance vehicles. But its design also explains why it can feel a little unusual in slow traffic. So the next time someone says dual clutch transmissions are terrible, there's a good chance they simply experienced it in the wrong situation. Because when used the way it was designed, a DCT can deliver some of the fastest and most satisfying gear changes in the automotive world. If you enjoy learning how cars and technology actually work, make sure to subscribe to Techie Tales. And if you've ever driven a car with a dual clutch transmission, I'd love to hear your experience. Did you enjoy the lightning-fast gear shifts, or did the low-speed behavior drive you crazy? Let me know in the comments.